All right, so part of our goal here as the Justice Network is to inform and help equip and educate for conversations that we hear going on in our church spaces and our friend spaces. And so one of those conversations that has been kind of a buzzword, a hot topic, is CRT. How many have heard of CRT? Critical race theory. How many have had befuddling conversations with folks about what CRT is or is not? Right? So we've invited our next guest. Her name is Larissa Malone. She previously taught at Greenville University and is currently acting as the assistant professor at the University of Southern Maine. And she is bravely going to come up and share with us what CRT is and what CRT is not, and how it serves us well in our context. Amen. Amen. And there will be a time for Q&A after her presentation. So you're going to have folks coming around passing out some index cards. I want you to start thinking about those questions you have. And if they haven't been answered and what Larissa is going to share with us, we'll have a moderated time of Q&A to ask those questions, because we think it's important that we're able to communicate with clarity, even when it's something that's really just kind of being used as a scapegoat to avoid the real conversation. Amen. Amen. So Larissa, come on up. We're excited to have you with us today.
All right, so I've presented on critical race theory and Christianity at a critical race theory conference, and now I'm presenting on it at a Christian conference, and I don't know which one I'm more nervous about. So here we are. So the invitation to speak here came out of the blue. I did something I normally don't do, and which is put myself out there a little bit. And on social media, I did 31 days of CRT in July, partly because I was just really exhausted by hearing a lot of people talk about something that I had studied for years and had no knowledge of what they were talking about. So I debated and I said, I'm just going to do it, right? And whatever comes of it, And from that, I ran into Topher online, and he invited me to come speak here. And we found out that we had many people in common. He was friends with a lot of my Greenville besties. And he also was friends with my cousin's family in Cleveland. And for a second, because I'm in my 40s, I was kind of like, do I know Topher? Maybe we know each other. I don't know. Turns out I wasn't losing my mind. We didn't. But I'm from Cleveland. So this is like homecoming for me. And when I say I'm from Cleveland, I lived the first 40 years of my life here. So my grandmother lived in the Tremont area before it was trendy. And actually I was married at a church just a block away and attended there for years. So 23 years ago, so we were married. So yeah, it's great to be home. So today I'm just going to talk a little bit about what CRT is, and like Larissa said, what CRT is not, and kind of the combination of CRT and Christianity. So I'm supposed to remember to tell the sound booth to say next slide, please, but they're following well. So before I speak, I usually talk about where I came from, because who we are as a person really informs how we speak, whether we acknowledge it or not. So I just like to go through the process of acknowledging it. So my father passed away just a couple years ago, but lived in Cleveland majority of his adult life. He's from Paducah, Kentucky. Shout out to Kentucky, right? And he came up to Ohio through what's called the second migration, right? So when Black folks were not satisfied or had opportunity in the South, they came up. And he's the only one of 13 that came up in his family. And here he met my mother. On my mother's side, I'm Puerto Rican, and that's who used to live in the Tremont area. My mom graduated down the street from Lincoln West. And so that's what stock I come from. Up there, I'm styling, profiling in the 3rd or 4th grade. And I grew up in Bedford, so Oakwood Village, and I went to Bedford school systems all the way through K through 12. That sexy guy in the middle right there is my husband, and he is an elder in our church, our non-denominational church. And he actually went to Cleveland Public Schools and then graduated from Maple Heights eventually. Like I said, we were married 23 years ago. We met on college campus, Case Western Reserve. I went to Walsh University. I got my doctorate at Kent State. So I am Northeast Ohio, born and bred. And those are our 3 girls. And we are on the countdown to being empty nesters. So, I think we're at 9 months and counting. So I don't feel like we talk about the children any less than what we did when they were babies, but maybe we'll eventually get there. I don't know. People who have experienced empty nesterism for longer than us will have to inform us how this goes. So, okay, next slide, please. So yeah, I'm an academic, right? And a term that is often used in research, right, is research is me-search, right? And that became my journey with critical race theory. So when I was at Kent State about a decade or so ago, when I was working on my dissertation, I was looking for a theory that really spoke to the work that I was doing. And I so happened upon critical race theory. And in that, like I said, it was me-search. So when I went to Bedford, for those that are not familiar with the area, it's a suburb. And when I first started in that school system, I was maybe one of 5 Blacks in my class, right? And by the time I graduated, it was probably about 70% Black, right? And critical race theory gave me a way to explain what white flight was, right? Why the demographics changed in the area, right? And really make sense of that, right? I also was in the gifted program in 3rd, 4th grade. And I was not only the only Black person, I was the only female. So unless you believe that only white males are smart, then there's something wrong with that picture, right? So critical race theory also just gave me a way to understand, again, my own personal journey. And at the same time, I was raising 3 girls and experiencing some of the same things, right? So they went to a private school, Old Trail School, which is in Cuyahoga Valley. And if they had 5 brochures that came out, my girls were on 4 of them, right? And again, critical race theory helps explain why that phenomena occurred, right? And I would like to think that they're just really cute, but I know that there's other reasons that are playing into that, right? So yeah, it helped me explain my personal experience. It also helped me explain how I was parenting as well, right? And it also helped me explain a lot of things that were going on largely in the education world, right? So one of those things is like the opportunity gap, right? Like if someone goes to Bay Village High School, that they have a 98% chance of going to college. But if they go to Garfield High School, then that rate drops to about, 40 to 50%. Why is that? Are the kids different? No. And critical race theory was a way to really help me explain and understand that. So when I studied critical race theory, I was studying it again for me, my own family, and to understand educational things that were going on. It was not to defend it in any way, right? Because I had no idea that it was going to become in the spotlight. And if you talk to any critical race theorist, they're like, what? I can't believe that on the news is something that we study. That is like really weird, right? So next slide, please. Okay. So like I said, today I'm just going to go through what CRT is, what CRT is not, talk a little bit about faith in CRT, and then Marissa's going to take over for the discussion. So next slide. So I want you guys to buckle up because I taught a CRT course at Kent State that took about 16 weeks. And we're going to cover it in about, I don't know, 14 to 15 minutes, right? So yeah. Okay, so next slide. And I'm going to give you just a second to read the slide. All right, so in most of these slides that are in the what CRT is and even what isn't CRT, I'll give a pause so you can read the slide, but I'm trying to put these into bite-sized portions, right? Because it is a lot of information. There are books and books and books written about CRT. But yeah, when you look at the most simple definition, it's really just a way to examine the relationship of race and society, right? It's a theory, right? So with a theory, it's just a way to kind of explain something. It's a lens that can that you can look through, right? In some ways, it's related to other theories, right? It believes knowledge is power. It believes that there is a relationship that needs to be acknowledged and oh, thank you. Sorry, deconstructed between the colonizer and the colonized. And that one of the goals is to empower people that study it, right? So next slide, please. So when you look at the origins of CRT, it's from the school, law school, right? So it was lawyers that really were not pleased with the assumption that we all have that picture in our mind of Lady Justice that has a blindfold on. And CRT acknowledges that she's probably peeking from under that blindfold, right? And seeing different things. One of those things is color, right? When rulings come out. So it really interrogated that concept that is widely accepted and really foundational to the legal field, right? And some of the influences are old school, right? So if you think of the Frankfurt School, Foucault, Derrida, Gramsci, those are the old school influences, but there's also a lot of new school influences like Martin Luther King, right? Pierre, the Black Power movement, the Chicano movement. And since its inception, there is so much written about it. There are people that concentrate on just different segments of it, right? So yesterday we heard from someone who brought up the AAPI community, right? And there's something called Asian Crit that totally focuses all their work on dismantling and understanding the Asian experience, right, in America. There's something that's called Lat Crit, right? That talks about the Latino experience in America. So it's multifaceted. And like I said, you can study it and study it and study it. And I don't consider myself an expert. I consider myself a scholar and a student of CRT in that way. All right, next slide, please. Okay, I'll give you a second to read it. So there's something that's called, you might have heard this word, tenets of CRT, and it's really just the principles of what critical race theory is. In that, you can talk to 10 different critical race scholars and they'll come up with 10 different tenets because no one has really listed out, the founders really didn't list it out. It's just these themes that keep on popping up across foundational critical race theory work. And this is one of the principles or tenets that pops up, that racism is permanent. It's something that we really have to deal with. And not only that, it's so foundational to what America is, not only how it was acquired, right, how we began, but also in the policies of America. So next slide, please. I'll give you a second to read it. Okay, this is what I want you to notice most, is that it's not only how we self-identify, right, that really influences how we see the world, it's also how we are identified by others. So no matter if I just say, I'm X, I'm not anything else, right? It doesn't matter if other people see that within me. I can say, I'm Christian. I don't even identify myself as Black. But if someone else sees me as Black, then that all of a sudden becomes a factor in the interpretation of who I am and what's expected of me. So in this, this is a little history lesson. This was something, again, not introduced at the very beginning of CRT. Kimberly Crenshaw, you may have heard of her. She runs the African American Policy Forum. She also is the person who started the Say My Name, hashtag Say Her Name movement. She wrote this in like 1989, and her second piece was like 1991, like a decade after CRT was formed. So, but again, she was articulated something that just kept on coming back up in the foundational documents. Okay, next slide, please. So this goes back to the idea of meritocracy, right? Like everyone has an equal chance. But again, if you go back to that illustration I said about differences in schools, right? Everyone doesn't necessarily have the same chance. And CRT acknowledges that. Okay, next slide. And we see this example of interest convergence in several different ways, right? One of them is maybe the Civil War. So people would like to think that President Lincoln declared that slavery should be abolished because of the best interests of the slaves, right? And that may have been a part of it, but it also was to hold the country together, right? And that's not always acknowledged. The same thing with civil rights, right? At the same time, we were contending with whether democracy was going to work. And there was a lot of pushback from around the world about communism, right? And when footage came out of Black children getting water hosed by the authorities in the country, then it was like, okay, maybe we need to do something. Maybe we need to pass something. Okay, next slide. And from this slide, I would like you to really grasp that it's just really ebbs and flows in racial progress, right? So we can have one step forward, right? We get Juneteenth, right? And then we have one step back that voting rights are taken away, right? Is not just linear. There is some sort of ebbs and flow and a struggle in there, right? And that justice is the struggle. It's not a final destination, right? So that's what I would like you to take away from racial realism. Okay, next slide. And I can give a pretty recent example of that. This slide, whiteness is property. I don't know if you listened to the news, maybe it was earlier this week or this weekend, there was a guy in Florida who was from the military, and he shot up a random family, and a baby was killed, and an 11-year-old survived. And they also used the word mental health in the conversation. He had a shootout with the police, and he was able to tell his side of the story because he wasn't killed. And I didn't have to turn on the TV to know that he was white, right? So, and that's whiteness is property in action. And then this is, I would argue that this is one of the more important tenets, or the most important tenet of critical race theory. Zora Neale Hurston, who wrote Their Eyes Are Watching God, talked about the importance of telling your own story, right? And she said something like, if you don't tell your own story, they'll murder you and say that you liked it, right? And everyone has a story. And typically, those that are marginalized and minoritized are silenced from telling their story, right? So CRT provides a platform for stories to be heard. Okay, moving to what CRT is not. And I would typically yell at my students if they wrote a paper about what something isn't, because I want to know what something is, not what it isn't. But in this climate, I think it's important just to go through these. The first thing is that it's not a curriculum. A curriculum is what you teach. And CRT is a theory, right? It's not what you teach. There's nothing prescribed in teaching. Okay, the next slide is that it's not a pedagogy. Pedagogy is how you teach, and it's not that either, right? Teaching from multiple perspectives is not called CRT. That's called good teaching, right? It's not conversionary. Next slide. So it's not to make anyone feel bad at all, right? However, if you're human and have a heart, you might, and that's okay if you feel uncomfortable. And we have to work through that, right? So, but that's not the intent of it. It's funny to me that in media, young white children were centered at the argument of CRT, and it was written by Black folks for Black folks. Okay, sorry. I'm getting all kinds of signals from the front row. All right. And lastly, I just want to say that it's not a catch-all. There's a lot of different words that mean a whole lot of different things that are all about race, right? One of them is diversity, one of them is equity. Maybe you heard of culturally relevant teaching. None of those are CRT. But anything related to race right now has been attributed to CRT, and that's not the case. So you have to have a clear understanding of what it is. And it's really employing those specific tenets is the rule. So why is it being demonized right now? And I'll let you read that. And we'll go into this a little bit more in the workshop later, but I'll just leave you with the phrase, the axe forgets and the tree remembers, right? And also, I just want to say it's no longer okay to say Black lives don't matter, right? So you have to pick something else to kind of put all your energy and anger towards, right? So. And I think CRT has become the target. All right, I want to spend the last time talking about faith in CRT. So I will say in my personal Christian walk, this was something that I really struggled with, right? Partly because the first part of me, of my Christian walk, growing up in church, my dad's a minister, was about avoiding hell, right? That was the kind of church I went to. And the second part, when I became an adult, was really about centering me in a lot of ways, right? So it was like during the prosperity gospel. And so I think there's probably place for both of those in the kingdom, but those were the messages that I was receiving. So I really didn't have a model of how to center social justice with my Christian faith. And there was something I had to work through, and I've been working through it really for the last 5 years, right? Enter Ben Wayman at Greenville, and he would introduce me and say, and her work is really needed here. And he would introduce me to someone else, and her work is really needed here. And probably the 5th time he said that, I was like, what do you mean? Because I saw my work in 2 different silos. I saw my race work in one silo and my church work in a different silo, and they never met. So he turned me on to some great readings. And that started my journey and really understanding what, how faith and CRT really blend together. So next slide. So in this, I had a partner in crime. She's at Georgia State, and we really tried to reason through this together. And we made lists and have a paper that's in publication right now. And it was like how Christianity kind of complemented CRT and also conflicted with CRT, right? Again, I said I spoke at Critical Race Theory Conference, and I was hesitant because I know there was going to be a lot of pushback of how Christianity really was an oppressor in a lot of ways and has been an oppressor in a lot of ways. So it was something that I really struggled with. I was blessed to go to Point Loma a couple times over the summer to really just, because everyone thinks better in SoCal, I think. But maybe it's just me, I don't know. But yeah, so to spend some time there on a faculty scholarship to really go through a lot of different work. So one of the main pieces that I went through, next slide, please, is the work of Derek Bell. He's one of the founders of critical race theory. And I related to him on two levels. One of them is that he helped dismantle desegregation. So I related on him on the educator level. But then also he incorporated spirituality in his work seamlessly, right? And he wrote about CRT, and it was just all throughout his work. Next slide, please. He talked about how spirituality was his greatest resource, right? His faith was his greatest resource. He also used parables throughout his work, right? Some of the titles of his books, and these are secular books, are scriptures, right? And he always brought it back to the recognition of the American Christian deficit of how it was used to oppress. And so that really informed me of how to inform my work, and then also how these two things could be married. So next slide. And through that, I was able to see a real connection through theology. Again, from my own limited background, I really didn't see how it connected. But because I was able to explore different theologies at my time at Greenville, I saw the connection, right? That social justice work is God's work, right? And a lot of the same things that I saw in Derek Bell's work when CRT was some of the same things I saw in James Cone's work. How we had to reframe Christianity, right? That Jesus is a liberator, that Jesus is an activist, right? And then within that, looking at those two different sides of conflict and complement to understand that conflict side was really about reconciliation, right? That's what we need to work through as a church. So my last slide is just saying thank you. And I'll hand it over to Larissa. Thank you.
Okay. You're going to help answer some questions. I will receive the questions. I'm going to ask everybody to pass their cards down to the center aisle, please, and those will be collected and brought up. In the meantime, for me, I think one of the biggest challenges I had when CRT started becoming like this buzzword and something people were getting ticked off about, right, was like, I believed this before CRT. Like there were tenets and patterns that were being called out through this study that I had seen before I even knew what CRT was. And now that term CRT was being used rather than being the tool that you described as, now it's being used as a weapon and it's being used to bash. And so personally, I tend to step away from those conversations because I realize that most of the time people are really just trying to make a point that alleviates that cognitive dissonance that you describe, rather than really wanting to engage in a constructive conversation. So yes, with grace, but we also have to operate within our own peace, right? We can't let somebody using what is to be a tool as a weapon to dissuade us from using our voices. in ways that propel the love of God, that propel the message of Jesus, that send us forward in really embracing one another and leaving the door open for those who are hesitant to say, when you're ready, you're welcome. When you're ready, I'm happy to sit down and have that conversation with you. Amen? So, first two questions. The first one is really easy. I'm going to start you off nice and slow. Okay. We have some folks asking if they could have access to the PowerPoint of this presentation. Is there a way we can make that available? Are you cool with that?
Yes, Topher has it.
Okay.
So.
All right. So we can ask you to send an email to Justice Network FMC. What's our Gmail? At Gmail? What's that? Oh, okay. We have everybody's email, so we will just send it out to everybody.
And I also can make available the 31 days of CRT, which is also a slide. So I can send that to Topher.
All right. Awesome. All right. The second question I have here is that the pushback from parents is not logical or truth-filled. How can it be countered?
Yeah, parents are powerful force within schools. I mean, I think information is the most powerful. I would dare say that most parents that are pushing back on it right now have not read anything on CRT, right? They're going off of what they have been told to fear, right? And honestly, I think information is the best weapon, right? So having thoughtful conversations, attending the same meetings that they're attending, if it's a board meeting, and having some talking points that counter or diffuse many of the falsehoods that are out there, right? So.
Yeah, it's helped me understanding what CRT is in these conversations to also not personalize and internalize what people are trying to throw at me and catch me off balance with. So it allows me to remain firm and like, no, I am okay, and I'm not a bad person in those conversations. So the next question we have is, what would you want to tell us white people regarding CRT?
I don't know. That's a funny question. I heard that a lot yesterday, and I was uncomfortable with it yesterday. I was like, what does that mean? I guess something that you probably are not expecting me to say is that it's not just a white problem, especially when you're thinking of CRT and Christianity. Every church I've ever went to is a Black church, and I did not encounter really the social justice aspect of Christianity till I met a white guy, right? So it's not a white thing per se, especially when you're looking at the church. I would say that, I think hearing counter stories is really important. And I was watching the news over the last couple of days, and I also seeing a lot of memes of nostalgia, let's say about September 11th and 20 years ago, and saying, oh, I remember we were all American then. We were all American. And I say to the TV, because I talk to the TV, until my husband threatens for me to turn it off. He's like, are you going to talk or are they going to talk? Which one? So, and I said, I'll be quiet. But I said to the TV, you mean white Americans, right? Because at that same time, if you were Muslim American, you didn't feel like the country was united at that time. I remember someone who, one of my husband's friends who was Egyptian, and he traveled a lot. He was a consultant. And right after September 11th, he came to my husband and says, are you okay traveling? Because I keep on getting interrogated at the airport. It was miserable for him. And he's American, right? So I think always acknowledging that there is not one single story, that it can always be countered in some sort of way. So. All
right, our next question. How would you explain the difference between theory a curriculum / application to those not in academia? How would you define theory?
A theory? It's just really a way to make sense of something, right? A lot of times people will say CRT is the lens, right, of how you look at something. And whether we acknowledge that we look through everything through a certain lens, we do. But CRT is just a lens. So a theory is just a lens to kind of view things. So way to interpret it as well. So how do you interpret what happened? So, is that helpful?
All right. So I'm going to kind of phrase these two together. One of the difficult aspects of using CRT as a framework is that it has been framed by those who are unfamiliar with it. How do you go beyond the fragility and rage and reframe to have constructive conversations? And what might be some resources that you recommend for becoming better informed?
Yeah, so I can send that to Topher as well, some resources that can go out about CRT. Even as a scholar, I always go back to the foundational documents, right? So it's kind of like as a Christian, you can read a lot of different things about Christianity, but you kind of want to go back to the Bible, right? So I always go back to the foundational documents all the time for CRT. And there's a lot of publications that are actually spot on CRT. And I don't even necessarily use those. I want to go back to the original source always. So it's almost like a historian. You want to have primary sources. You can't have secondary sources. You can talk to somebody who heard from somebody who was there, right? Or you can just talk to the person there, right? And so that's what, so I can send a list. Yeah.
Awesome. I'm so excited about all these resources. Those are like all bonus that didn't fit in our swag bags, right? So we've kind of alluded to this pushback that CRT is receiving. I think some of us have heard it, but could you better define what the current pushbacks against CRT are so that we know what we're...
Yeah, so it's being banned in some states from being taught. It also is being banned in some states for even it to be some sort of training, like in corporate settings. So there's a lot of pushback on, honestly, it's really diversity, equity, and inclusion work, but it's under the guise of critical race theory.
So one of the slides that really stood out to me when I was following your 31 days was the concept of whiteness as property. Mm-hmm. And I've also received that as a pushback, somebody really kind of misconstruing and twisting it. So can you say more about whiteness as property and kind of give us a little bit more clarity on that?
Yeah, so I can give a quick overview. One of the resources I'll send is from Cheryl Harris in 1993, wrote a, 50-page paper about whiteness as property. So that would be the primary source to go to. But it's really understanding that whiteness is sometimes, she equated it to property. And the reason why she equated it to property is because she's a lawyer, and that's something that has been historically argued and debated in law. So she equated it to that to really give an understanding of how, just like the example I gave with the guy in Florida, I didn't need to look at the TV to know that if he got all those passes, it was because he was white.
So the way I framed it and understood it was that it's kind of a characteristic that you carry or that you can carry that you can. Okay.
So like property, right? It's just something that you almost own. You can use to trade. You can use to barter in some ways because you know that if, I think, was this said yesterday? I think it was said when you were doing the privilege exercise. If you call management and you know that if you're white, that management is also white, that they're going to be able to relate to you in some sort of way. That is an automatic pass in some ways, right? And that's something that can't be possessed by people of color.
Right. So I'm processing. I hope you guys will be patient as I'm processing. So being somebody who presents pretty ambiguously, I am a woman of color, I'm multiracial. I am able to carry whiteness as property. For example, I've been looking for an apartment, a new rental for my family. We are relocating. And the thought occurred to me, if I go looking without my white husband, we might not have as good an outturn, right? And my thought that crossed my mind was, maybe when I go look at apartments, I should straighten my hair,
Right.
because then I can carry something that allows me to pass as more white into that space. Would that be a good example?
Right. That's exactly a great example.
Okay.
Another example where I tap into whiteness as property is that I know I sound white on the phone, right? So I get often from people that are very nice to me on the phone because they think I'm white and I have a property in my voice, right? That alludes to that. And they'll meet me and they'll treat me differently or say to me, "You don't look like how I thought you would look." So, and that has happened all throughout my life. So, yes.
All right, so going back to those pushbacks, one of the main critiques we often hear is that CRT has its basis and origins in Marxism. Is there any truth to that?
So Marxism is part of the Frankfurt School, right? So there is some truth to it. Again, those truths of knowledge is power, right? There's a relationship between the colonized and the colonizer that needs to be interrogated, right? But again, there's also some very new school influences as well that contribute just as much to critical race theory. And if you read those foundational documents, Marx isn't mentioned at all, right? That's not what the origins are. The origins actually began in America with Brown versus Board of Education through Derek Bell, who was really disillusioned because he helped go through the South to dismantle schools 10 years after people didn't comply, and was just almost felt that it should have been separate and equal because people are so unwilling in their hearts to comply with brown people coming to their school. So, yeah.
So part of the, trying to read this word, part of the barrier to understanding things like CRT is our focus on individuality. Amen. As the source of our identity. How do you help people see and understand the reality and power of social structure that transcend our individuality and yet we share in responsibility for?
Yeah, I would say that the first thing is that you need to make sure that the person who's asking the question is willing to hear the answer. Because a lot of people ask that question and they don't want to hear the answer, right? So I think that's the first thing that really needs to be clarified, like Marissa said, with grace, right? But if you're not serious about having this conversation, then why are we having it? I think it's Brene Brown, and I'll mess up paraphrasing what she said, but she said something like, if you want to understand where someone's coming from, you have to understand, you have to listen for where they're coming from, not interpret through your eyes how you think they should feel, right? And so I think that's the biggest barrier. And you have to have a willing heart. I mean, yeah, I mean, and you can't control that for someone else, unfortunately. So.
Yeah, and that really speaks right into a lot of what we talked about yesterday, right? Is the power of the story and how the story allows us to be more proximal to somebody else's experience and to allow ourselves to better step into another pair of shoes and understand. So thank you so much, Larissa. I want to encourage you guys, if we did not get to your question, Larissa is going to be hosting one of our workshops. So you can ask her some questions there. She might be kind enough to answer questions over dinner. She's going to be with us for the rest of the day. She was here yesterday, and we're so glad that you were here to join us. Can we give Larissa a round of applause, please?